For 24 years, I built a fortress around my life, not of concrete and steel, but of silence, of distance. I designed it myself, brick by invisible brick. Each brick was a missed phone call, an unanswered letter, a holiday spent alone. Each one was a night I worked until my eyes burned, a goal I hit, a step I took away from the little girl they left behind. I thought it was impenetrable. I really did. I thought the walls were so high, the moat of my success so wide, that no one from my past could ever find their way across. I was wrong. The thing about the past is, it doesn't need a map. It has your scent. It remembers where you came from, even if you spent a lifetime trying to forget. And some ghosts, well, some ghosts don't just haunt you, they find your address. The silence on my doorstep was a physical thing. It was heavier than the humid, rain-soaked air that clung to the three figures huddled there. It was a silence filled with 24 years of unspoken words, of questions I'd long ago stopped asking, of apologies I knew I would never receive. They just stood there, dripping onto my imported slate tiles, looking like a photograph that had been left out in the sun, faded, distorted, but unmistakably them, the family that replaced me. My father, Richard, was the first to break. His voice was a pathetic rasp, a shadow of the booming, confident voice I remembered from my childhood. Alara, Ellie. He used my childhood nickname, and it felt like a violation, like a key he no longer had the right to use, scraping against a lock I had changed decades ago. He looked old. Not just the late 50s old that he was, but a deeper, more profound kind of old, the kind that comes from failure. His shoulders were slumped, his hair was thinning and damp, and his eyes, those same blue eyes that had once looked at me with what I thought was love, were now just watery and desperate. Beside him, Brenda, the stepmother, forced a smile. It was a grotesque thing, a sickly sweet rictus that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. Those eyes were busy. They were darting around, taking in the grand two-story entryway, the floating staircase, the piece of abstract art I'd paid a small fortune for. Her glamour had faded, the expensive dye job growing out at the roots, the once plumped lips now thin and tight with envy. She was assessing my life, calculating its worth, and I could almost hear the little abacus clicking in her head. "Alara, honey," she cooed, her voice dripping with a false humility that was more insulting than any overt hostility. "My, you've done so well for yourself. This house, it's just beautiful." It was such a transparent, clumsy attempt at flattery. She wasn't complimenting me, she was complimenting my things. She was trying to find a foothold, a way into the life she could see laid out before her, a life she clearly felt she was owed a piece of. And then there was Tiffany, my stepsister, the girl who got the father I lost. She just stood there, shivering, clutching the ridiculously large and now probably ruined designer handbag. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at her feet, her face a mask of sullen misery. She looked like a deer in headlights, a pampered princess who had just been tossed out of her castle and couldn't comprehend why the world was suddenly so cold and wet. In her, I saw the petulant, spoiled child she'd always been, just wrapped in a slightly older, more desperate package. I just stood there, holding the heavy oak door open, letting the cold air wash over them, over my pristine entryway. I didn't invite them in. I didn't offer a towel. I just waited. I had learned patience in the long, quiet years they were gone. I could wait them out. My father, Richard, cleared his throat again, a nervous, rattling sound. "Look, Ellie, I know this is a lot. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't an emergency." As he spoke, my mind flickered, quick, disorienting flashes like a corrupted video file. Me, 9 years old, standing in this exact same spot, in the old house that once stood on this very plot of land, a suitcase by the door. His suitcase. I remember the smell of his cologne, the rough texture of his jacket, and I remember his back. That's the clearest image of all.
the broad, unforgiving shape of his back as he walked away, got into a waiting taxi, and never once, not for a single second, looked back at the little girl crying in the doorway. The image was desaturated in my memory, drained of all color, just a gray man walking away from a gray life. My life. I blinked, the present slamming back into focus. He was still talking, the words tumbling out in a pathetic, rehearsed rush. "We're in a bit of a rough patch, Ellie. Just a bit of a jam." A rough patch. A jam. The euphemisms were almost comical. They minimized their catastrophe into something small and manageable, something a Band-Aid could fix. Brenda chimed in, stepping forward as if to assert her place. "What your father was trying to say, Alara, is that we've had some very, very bad luck. The market, well, it turned against us. We lost the house." Tiffany finally looked up, her lower lip trembling. "And my car, they took my car. All my friends are laughing at me." The sheer, unadulterated selfishness of it all was breathtaking. They weren't here because they missed me. They weren't here to atone. They were here because their ATM had run dry and they were looking for a new one. Finally, Richard got to the point, the real reason they were standing on my porch, soaking wet and reeking of desperation. His face crumpled, and actual tears, big, fat crocodile tears, welled up in his eyes. He took a step closer, reaching a hand out as if to touch my arm. I flinched back, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and his hand dropped. "Ellie," he choked out, the word thick with manufactured emotion, "we have nowhere to go. We've lost everything. Everything." He looked around at my home, at the life I had built from the rubble of the one he'd destroyed. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading. And then he asked the unthinkable. "Can we stay with you? Please? Just for a little while? Just until we get back on our feet?" 24 years. 24 years of birthdays, of Christmases, of graduations. 24 years of sickness and struggle and small, lonely victories. 24 years of absolute, deafening silence. And their first words to me weren't, "I miss you." They weren't, "How are you?" They weren't even the two words I had craved as a child, the two words that might have healed a tiny fraction of the wound they'd left. "I'm sorry." No, their first words were, "I need." I looked past them, at the rain falling on my perfectly manicured lawn, at the sleek, dark shapes of the expensive cars in my driveway. I had built all of this, not just to have it, but to protect myself from ever feeling the kind of desperation I saw in their eyes. My home was my armor, my success was my shield, and they thought they could just walk up and ask to shelter behind it? A strange sort of calm settled over me. The anger, the hurt, the shock, it all receded, replaced by something cold and clear and sharp. I closed my eyes for just a second, a single deliberate beat. When I opened them, a slow, chilling smile played on my lips. It probably didn't look kind. It wasn't meant to. "Come in," I said, my voice smooth, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. I stepped back, opening the door wider. "Let's talk." As they shuffled past me into the warmth and light of my home, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief, I let the heavy door swing shut. The sound of it closing, the final, definitive click of the lock, echoed in the sudden silence. It felt like closing the lid on a trap. The day he left is seared into my memory with the kind of brutal clarity that time can't dull. I was 9. 9 is a funny age. You're old enough to understand when something is deeply, fundamentally wrong, but you're too young to have the words for it. You just feel it, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of your stomach. He told me he was going on a trip. That's the word he used, trip. It sounded so temporary, so fun, like he was going to Disneyland or to visit a friend. He was packing a single suitcase, and I remember watching him, trying to be helpful. I asked if he needed his favorite sweater. I asked if he was going somewhere cold. He was vague, evasive. "Just a little getaway, Ellie Bean. I'll be back before you know it." Kids are smarter than we give them credit for. I knew, even then, that it wasn't a trip. It was an escape. The real question, the one that spun in my 9-year-old mind, was what was he escaping from? Was it the quiet, sad house that still echoed with my mother's absence? Was it the bills piling up on the kitchen counter? It took me a little while to understand the devastating truth.
The thing he was escaping from was me. I remember standing on a chair in the kitchen, carefully making him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, folding it into a napkin and putting it in a brown paper bag, just like my mom used to. I drew a little heart on the bag. I handed it to him as he stood by the door, and he took it, but he didn't look at it. He just tucked it under his arm, ruffled my hair, and said, "Be a good girl for your Aunt Carol, okay?" Then he was gone. The first few weeks were a blur of confusion and a deep, gnawing anxiety. I was shuttled off to live with my Aunt Carol, my mom's sister. I love my aunt, but back then she was completely overburdened. She had 3 kids of her own, a tiny, cramped apartment that always smelled of boiled cabbage and stress, and a husband who worked 2 jobs. I was just one more mouth to feed, one more body taking up space. I slept on a lumpy sofa in the living room, and every night I'd lie there in the dark, listening to the sounds of a family that wasn't mine, and I'd wait. I waited by the window for his car to pull up. I jumped every time the phone rang. I told my cousins, "My dad's on a trip. He'll be back soon." I said it so many times, I almost started to believe it myself. He called once, a week after he left. The connection was staticky, his voice distant. He asked if I was being good. I said yes. I asked when he was coming home. He said soon. Then he said he had to go. That was it. That was the last time I heard his voice for 24 years. Then, about a month after he left, the postcard arrived. It wasn't a big dramatic reveal, it was just there, in the pile of bills and junk mail my aunt had tossed on the coffee table. The front was a picture of a sun-drenched beach, water so blue it hurt your eyes, and pristine white sand. The Maldives, the caption read. It looked like a different planet compared to the gray, drizzly reality outside my aunt's apartment window. I picked it up. It wasn't from my dad. It was from her. From Brenda. Her handwriting was bubbly and round, each eye dotted with a perfect little circle. It was the handwriting of a woman who had never known a single day of hardship. "Having a wonderful time on our honeymoon," it read. "Richard is so happy. Tiffany is loving the sun. Wish you were here. The new Mrs. Miller." Honeymoon. The word hit me like a physical blow. It knocked the wind out of my 9-year-old body. The new Mrs. Miller. He hadn't just gone on a trip. He had gotten married. He had started a whole new life. I turned the postcard over, and there they were. A glossy photograph of my father, Richard, tanned and smiling, his arm wrapped around Brenda. She was laughing, head thrown back, and next to them, building a sandcastle with a bright pink bucket and spade, was a gleeful, sun-kissed little girl with blonde pigtails. Tiffany. My father's face is what I remember most. He looked free. He was a man without a care in the world. A man who had successfully shed his old life like a snake sheds its skin. There was no trace of the sad, quiet house, no trace of the grief for my mother, and no trace of me. Wish you were here. 4 simple words. 4 words that felt like a death sentence to the little girl I was. They weren't just on vacation. They were celebrating the official start of their new family. A family built on the ashes of our old one. They weren't just forgetting about me. They were actively, joyfully rubbing it in my face. It was a message. It said, "We are happy because you are not here. Our new life required your absence." Sitting there on the lumpy floral sofa in my aunt's cramped, noisy apartment, a profound and terrible shift happened inside me. I stopped being a daughter waiting for her father to come home. I became an inconvenience they'd left behind, a piece of baggage they'd decided not to check. In that moment, the hope I'd been clinging to didn't just fade, it was violently extinguished. And in its place, something else started to grow, something harder, something colder. I took the postcard, and with a strength I didn't know I had, I crumpled it into a tight,
hard ball in my small fist. The glossy paper cracked and groaned, Richard's smiling face disappearing into the creases. My face hardened. The tears stopped. I knew with the chilling certainty only a deeply wounded child can possess that I was completely and utterly on my own. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where the floor falls out from under you and you realize you're in free fall with no one to catch you? Let me know in the comments when that turning point was for you. When did you realize you had to be your own hero? The memory faded, sharp and painful as ever, and I was back in my living room, my pristine, silent, minimalist living room. The three of them were sitting awkwardly on my white leather sofa, looking profoundly out of place, like crows in a dove's nest. Brenda was still running her hand over the expensive fabric, her eyes wide. Richard was staring at his hands. Tiffany was scrolling sullenly through her phone, probably lamenting her lost social status to whatever friends she had left. I had left them to go to the kitchen, not out of hospitality, but to give myself a moment to breathe, to push the image of that crumpled postcard back into the box where I kept it locked away. I returned with a sleek silver tray holding 3 glasses of iced water. I didn't offer coffee or tea or anything that suggested comfort or a long stay, just water, a basic human necessity, nothing more. Brenda took a glass, her eyes still roving over the room from the floor to ceiling windows to the custom-built shelving. A look of pure, unadulterated jealousy mixed with awe was plastered on her face. It was the look of someone who believes they are entitled to the very things they are seeing. I set the tray down on the marble coffee table with a soft click. I looked at each of them, my gaze lingering for a moment on my father's bowed head. Then, I sat down in the armchair opposite them, crossing my legs, the picture of calm control. "So," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, "you lost everything. Tell me how." The question wasn't an invitation to share, it was a demand. It hung there in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. I wasn't asking for their story, I was asking for their confession. They told their story, and it was exactly as pathetic as I had imagined. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a slow-motion car crash of their own making, a symphony of bad decisions and breathtaking entitlement. They spoke of it all as if it were a natural disaster, a hurricane or an earthquake that had descended upon them without warning. They refused to see it for what it truly was, the bill for a lifetime of selfish choices finally coming due. Richard went first, his voice weak and meandering. He talked about bad advice from a financial planner, the few unlucky bets on the stock market that went south. He painted himself as a victim of a volatile economy, a good man who just got caught in the undertow. He never once said, "I was greedy," or "we spent money we didn't have," or "I gambled away our future trying to buy a life I couldn't afford." It was all external forces, all bad luck. He took no ownership, no responsibility. He was just a passenger in the car he had driven off a cliff. Then Brenda took over, and her narrative was even more infuriating. She whined. My God, how she whined. She lamented the loss of their country club membership, the humiliation of having her credit cards declined at her favorite boutique. She spoke of their financial ruin in terms of social status, as if the worst part about being broke was what the neighbors would think. "We had to keep up appearances, Alara," she said, as if this was a law of physics. Tiffany was at a very good school. Her friends, their parents are all very successful. We had to fit in. Fitting in. That was their grand justification. They had bankrupted themselves, not for survival, not for necessity, but for the shallow validation of people they probably didn't even like. And Tiffany, Oh, Tiffany. Her contribution was the cherry on top of this pathetic Sunday. She complained about losing her new convertible, which Daddy had bought her for her birthday. She complained that she couldn't go on the spring break trip to Cancun with her friends. She looked at me, her eyes welling with tears, and said, "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have to tell people your parents are broke? My life is literally over." Literally over? I sat there, listening to them, and my face was a mask of placid neutrality, but inside, a fire was raging. As they spun their tale of woe, my own life flashed before my eyes. Not in quick, disorienting bursts, but in a long, grueling montage. I saw myself at 17, studying late into the night at the kitchen table in Aunt Carol's apartment, textbooks piled high, the only one in the house still awake. I was determined to get a scholarship, to escape, to build something for myself. I saw myself in college, working 3 different jobs to make ends meet, waitressing, scrubbing floors in the campus library, tutoring freshmen. I remember the bone-deep exhaustion, the cheap ramen noodles that were my staple diet, the constant low-grade hum of anxiety about making rent. I saw myself sketching designs on coffee-stained napkins in a dingy diner at 3 in the morning, fueled by cheap coffee and sheer, bloody-minded determination. My first apartment, a tiny, dark studio with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The slow, grueling, exhilarating climb up the ladder of my career. The rejections, the setbacks, the 80-hour work weeks, the moments of triumph. Small at first, then bigger. The first major contract I landed. The day I signed the papers for this very plot of land. My life hadn't been an accident. It was an act of will. I had built it, piece by painful piece, with my own 2 hands. My resilience in the face of their weakness, my discipline in the face of their indulgence. They had spent 24 years living on credit, and I had spent 24 years building equity. And now, their credit had run out, and they had come to cash in on mine. There was no apology in their story, not a single word of remorse for the past, just excuses for the present. They had walked into my home not as penitent family members, but as laid-off employees expecting a severance package. When they finally finished, a hopeful silence filled the room. They looked at me, their eyes pleading, waiting for my sympathy, my pity, my checkbook. They expected me to rage, to cry, to lecture them, or they hoped I would just sigh, say, "Family is family," and offer them a guest room. I did neither. Instead of throwing them out, which is what every fiber of my being screamed to do, I leaned forward, a plan solidifying in my mind. A plan that had been dormant for years, a little seed of an idea I never thought I'd need to plant. This was the first step in my catharsis, my quiet, calculated revenge. "I see," I said, my voice even. "That is a difficult situation." I let them hang on for that for a moment, letting them think I was softening. Then I made my proposition. "As it happens," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I might have a solution, a temporary one." Hope flickered in their eyes. Richard leaned forward eagerly. "Anything, Ellie, will do anything." I looked at them, my gaze sweeping over their soft, uncalloused hands. "It's not in great shape right now. It needs a lot of work. Painting, cleaning, repairs, yard work. But it has a roof and the utilities work. You can live there, rent-free." Their faces lit up. Rent-free? It was more than they could have dreamed of. But I wasn't finished. "On one condition," I added, and the light in their eyes dimmed slightly. "You provide the labor. You help me fix it up. You will put in the work, sweat equity. You want a roof over your heads? You'll earn it. Every day." The silence that followed was thick with their shock. Brenda and Tiffany looked absolutely horrified. The idea of manual labor, of getting their hands dirty, was as foreign and repulsive to them as living on the moon. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Tiffany just stared, aghast. "Manual labor?" Tiffany squeaked, as if I'd just suggested she perform her own surgery. "But my nails! I don't know how to do any of that stuff." "You'll learn," I said, my voice flat. But Richard, desperate, saw it for what it was, a lifeline. He wasn't in a position to negotiate. "We'll do it," he said quickly, shooting a warning glare at his wife and daughter. "Of course, we'll do it." "Thank you, Ellie, thank you." He forced them to nod in agreement, their movements stiff and resentful. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "It's a test," I said, my voice smooth as silk, letting the words hang in the air. "I need to see if you've really changed. I need to see if you're willing to work for a second chance." Of course, it was a test. They were right about that, but it wasn't to see if they had changed. I already knew they hadn't. People like them don't change, they just change tactics. No, the test was for me. It was to make them feel, just for one single, solitary moment, the crushing weight of desperation and powerlessness that I had felt for years. It was to make them understand that nothing in this world is free, especially not my forgiveness. The next day, I drove them to the old house. It stood there, a sad, neglected skeleton of my childhood memories. The paint was peeling in long, curling strips. The porch sagged, and the yard was a jungle of weeds and thorns. It was a perfect, decaying monument to the family they had abandoned right there on that spot. I handed Tiffany a paint scraper. She looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. I gave Brenda a bucket and a sponge and pointed to the grimy, mildew-stained kitchen floors. I tasked Richard with clearing the overgrown yard, handing him a pair of rusty shears. They stood there, miserable and lost. I stood on the porch, my arms crossed, watching them. A cool breeze rustled the dead leaves in the yard. "The work begins now," I said. The camera in my mind focused on their faces. Brenda's look of utter disgust, Tiffany's pout of childish resentment, and Richard's hollow-eyed despair. The price of their second chance was about to be paid in blisters and sweat, and I was going to enjoy collecting every drop. The first week of their work was a disaster. A beautiful, glorious, predictable disaster. It was almost comedic, watching these three people who had spent their lives cultivating softness and avoiding anything that remotely resembled effort try to engage in manual labor. It was like watching a poodle try to herd sheep. The days fell into a pattern. I would drop by in the morning, give them their tasks, and leave for my actual job, directing real construction crews on multi-million-dollar projects. I'd return in the evening to check on their progress, which was usually negligible and accompanied by a litany of complaints. Tiffany was by far the most useless. Her main contribution was documenting her struggle for social media. She'd spend hours trying to get the perfect selfie, a smudge of dirt artfully placed on her cheek, a paint scraper held like a prop. Her captions were a masterclass in passive-aggressive martyrdom. #hard work, #renovation life, so tired, family first. She once spent an entire afternoon complaining that the dust was ruining her hair extensions. I watched her try to use a hammer, and she held it by the head, tapping the nail weakly with the end of the handle. It was pathetic. Brenda was a different kind of terrible. She was the queen of passive aggression. She wouldn't refuse to work, but she would do it with an air of long-suffering nobility that was infinitely more irritating. "Oh, this old paint," she'd sigh loudly as I walked by. "It's just so stubborn, isn't it? Not like the new, eco-friendly paint they used in our old house. That was a dream to clean." She would shriek in terror at the sight of a spider, bringing all work to a halt for 20 minutes. She tried to scrub the kitchen floor once, but declared the sponge unhygienic and spent the rest of the day researching organic, cruelty-free cleaning products on her phone. Richard, to his credit, at least tried, but he was clumsy, out of shape, and utterly inept. He was a man who had paid people to do things for him his entire adult life. He didn't know the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. He once tried to fix a leaky faucet and ended up flooding the entire bathroom. I came back that evening to find him standing in an inch of water, looking completely defeated, while Brenda and Tiffany were yelling at him from the hallway. He accidentally broke a window trying to clear a stubborn vine from the frame. He just stared at the shattered glass, the picture of broken masculinity. All the while, they argued, constantly. The stress of the situation, the unfamiliar labor, and the cramped, dirty conditions frayed their already thin bonds. Brenda would snipe at Richard for his incompetence. Tiffany would whine at Brenda for making her do gross things. Richard would just absorb it all, his face a mask of weary resignation. Their perfect little sandcastle family was crumbling into dust under the first sign of pressure. While they toiled in their self-inflicted purgatory, my life continued. I'd leave them bickering over who had to clean the paintbrushes and drive across town to one of my commercial development sites. There, I was in my element. I'd walk the site in my steel-toed boots and hard hat, directing teams of skilled professionals, making decisions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars with a single phone call. The contrast was stark, and it was deliberate. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to understand the chasm that separated my world of competence and creation from their world of ineptitude and decay. Then came the turning point. About 2 weeks into the charade, one evening I was reviewing some documents at the old house. I made a show of being stressed, of having too much work. When I left, I accidentally forgot my laptop, leaving it open on the dusty kitchen counter. I knew they would snoop. Entitlement is a curious beast. It breeds a profound sense of nosiness. People who believe the world owes them something also believe they have a right to its secrets. I left the bait, and just as I predicted, they swam right for it. I can picture the scene perfectly. Brenda, ever the opportunist, would have been the first one to notice it. She would have crept over, her eyes darting around, and seen the email I had left open on the screen. It was an email from my real estate lawyer, a very real lawyer discussing a very real matter. The subject line read, "Finalization of the Westbrook Trust." The email itself was short and to the point. It discussed the final legal steps for me to gain full and sole control of the principal, estimated at $4.7 million on Tuesday of next week. I can just imagine Brenda's eyes going wide with greed, the dollar signs practically clicking into place behind her pupils. $4.7 million. It was the answer to all their prayers, a lottery ticket they hadn't even had to buy. She would have grabbed Richard and Tiffany immediately, her voice a hushed, excited whisper. "Look at this, look!" Their motivation changed instantly. It was like a switch had been flipped. Suddenly, the squalor, the hard work, the misery, it was all worth it. It wasn't a punishment anymore. It was an investment. If they could just play their cards right, if they could just endure this little test and win me over, they wouldn't just get a roof over their heads, they would get a piece of a massive fortune. The change in their behavior the next day was so dramatic, it was almost laughable.
When I arrived, the house was a hive of activity. Richard was cheerfully hacking away at the weeds in the yard, whistling. Brenda was scrubbing the windows with a vigor I didn't think she possessed, humming a little tune. They were sickeningly sweet. "Good morning, Alara," Brenda chirped, her smile so bright it was blinding. "We just thought we'd get an early start, so much to do." Tiffany, my God, Tiffany was the worst. She actually brought me a cup of coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted like dirt, but she presented it to me with a flourish, as if it were a gift from the gods. "I made this for you, sis," she said. Sis? The word sounded so alien, so wrong coming from her lips. She had never once called me that in her entire life. I took the coffee, my expression unreadable. I watched them work,
their movements now filled with a desperate, greedy energy. They were performing, putting on a show for an audience of one. They were no longer working for a house. They were auditioning for a role in my life, a role that came with a very, very generous salary. Is there anything more insulting than fake kindness? That cloying, insincere sweetness from someone who you know despises you but wants something from you? What's the most two-faced thing someone has ever done to you? I'd be fascinated to read your stories in the comments. I watched their pathetic performance for the rest of the week. They praised my work ethic. They admired my taste. They asked about my life, feigning interest in a past they had so callously discarded. It was all a prelude to the grand finale. On Friday evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the half-cleared yard, Richard approached me. He had cleaned himself up. His face was arranged into a mask of deep, solemn remorse. He wrung his hands together, his eyes glistening with unshed and completely fraudulent tears. "Ellie," he began, his voice cracking with expertly timed emotion, "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week, working on this house, our old house. It's brought so much back." He took a shaky breath. "I am so sorry for everything, for leaving, for not being there for you. I see now what a terrible, terrible mistake I made. I was a fool and a coward. Can you ever find it in your heart to forgive your old man?" He looked at me, his face a perfect picture of a repentant father begging for his daughter's grace. Behind him, Brenda and Tiffany watched, their expressions hopeful, like spectators at a high-stakes poker game, waiting to see if my hand would fold. I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I let the silence stretch, letting him sweat, letting him think his performance had worked. Then I spoke. "Meet me here tomorrow night, all of you, 7 o'clock sharp." My voice was calm, level. "I've made my decision." I turned and walked to my car, leaving them standing there in the twilight, their hearts no doubt pounding with greedy anticipation.
They thought they had won. They thought the jackpot was just one day away. They had no idea they were walking into a reckoning. They arrived at the house at 7 o'clock on the dot. They had clearly made an effort. Richard was wearing a clean, pressed shirt. Brenda had managed to do something with her hair and had applied a full face of makeup, a hopeful, painted mask. Even Tiffany was wearing a dress, looking uncharacteristically neat and tidy. They looked like they were on their way to a will reading, which, in a way, they were. Their faces were alight with poorly concealed greed, their eyes gleaming with the promise of millions. I let them in. They walked into the living room and stopped dead. The house was not filled with renovation supplies. The drop cloths were gone, the tools were gone, the dust and grime were gone. The house was empty, spotlessly, eerily clean. The wooden floors, which they had spent days sanding and scrubbing, gleamed under the single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was still and silent. In the center of the vast, empty room where the sofa used to be, stood a single, large projector screen. They thought they were walking into their future, a future of inherited wealth and easy living. I was about to force them to look directly into the past they had tried so hard to bury. I was standing by the far wall, waiting for them. I was dressed immaculately in a sharp black pantsuit, power dressing. I didn't smile. I didn't greet them. I just watched as their hopeful expressions faltered, replaced by a dawning confusion. "Ilara, what's all this?" Richard asked, his voice uncertain. "Where's all the furniture?" "We're not here to discuss furniture," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty room. "Before we discuss your future," I let the word hang in the air, a deliberate, cruel choice. "I want to show you something." I clicked a button on the remote in my hand. The projector whirred to life, casting a bright square light onto the screen. Then an image appeared. It was a photograph of a little girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth, smiling proudly next to a lopsided birthday cake. A little girl with my face. The cake had 10 candles. She was sitting at a small kitchen table, and next to her was Aunt Carol, looking tired but smiling.
There was no one else in the picture. The projector clicked, and another image appeared. Me at my high school graduation in my cap and gown holding my diploma. Aunt Carol and my cousins were there, beaming, but there was a conspicuous gaping hole where a father should have been. No Richard in the crowd. Click. A photo of the tiny, run-down apartment I lived in during college, the one with the window that faced a brick wall. Click. The screen went dark, and a sound filled the room, the sound of a little girl's voice, hesitant and small, recorded on an old answering machine tape. "Hi, Daddy. It's me, Ellie. I got an A on my spelling test today."
I hope you're having a good trip. When are you coming home? I miss you. Bye. Another voicemail played, and another. A collection of my childhood pleas, each one ending with the same question, each one going unanswered. Their faces began to change. The confusion was morphing into a dawning horror. Then the final image flashed onto the screen, a high-resolution scan of the postcard, the sun-drenched beach in the Maldives, the bubbly handwriting, and the picture. Richard, Brenda, and Tiffany, a happy, laughing family building a sandcastle, celebrating their new life. I zoomed in on my father's smiling face, the face of a man who had won the lottery. I let the image burn into the screen, into their retinas. I let the silence in the room become a crushing weight. When I finally spoke, my voice was no longer calm. It was the voice I had suppressed for 24 years. It was raw, it was powerful, and it was filled with the righteous, incandescent fury of a wronged child who had finally grown up. "You want to talk about losing everything?" I began, my voice trembling with controlled rage. "You didn't lose everything last month in the stock market. You lost it 24 years ago when you walked out that door." I turned my eyes on Brenda. She flinched as if I'd struck her. "And you?" I spat. "You didn't want a husband. You wanted an upgrade. You wanted a man who would buy you a bigger house and better vacations, and I was the baggage you made him check at the door. You wrote 'Wish you were here' on that postcard. Did you? Did you wish I was there, Brenda? Or did you wish I would just disappear forever so you could have him all to yourself?" She just stared, her mouth agape, the painted mask of her makeup suddenly looking cracked and grotesque. Then I turned to Tiffany. She was openly crying now, big gulping sobs. "You," I said, my voice dripping with contempt, "you got the childhood I was supposed to have. You got the vacations, the new clothes, the convertible. You got the father. All of it. Paid for by the life you and your mother helped steal from me. You complained about your life being literally over because you lost your car. My life was over at 9 years old, and you were building a sandcastle at the funeral?" Finally, I faced my father, Richard. He looked like a broken man, his face gray, his body trembling. The fake tears were gone, replaced by the real, ugly tears of a man forced to look at his own monstrous reflection. "And you?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "You are the worst of them all, because you were my father. You were my father. Your only job, your one sacred duty, was to protect me, and you didn't just fail. You actively traded me. You traded your daughter for a new wife, for a beach vacation, for a goddamn sandcastle." The air was electric with their shattered silence. They thought this was the end of the sermon. They were wrong. This was just the preamble. "But you know," I continued, a cold smile touching my lips, "you were right about one thing. There is a trust fund." A flicker of some insane, desperate hope crossed their faces. "Even now." My maternal grandmother, your first wife's mother, Richard, was a very smart woman. She knew you. She knew your character, or lack thereof, and she left me a significant amount of money, the money that you found out about on my laptop. I walked over to a small table in the corner and picked up a leather-bound document. My grandmother's will. "It's real," I said, watching their eyes light up with that familiar, ugly greed. But my grandmother was a thorough woman. She knew you might one day come crawling back, so she put in a very specific, very special clause, a little poison pill just for you.
I opened the document to a bookmarked page and read the clause aloud, my voice clear and ringing in the empty house. In the event that my former son-in-law, Richard Miller, his current or any future spouse, or his issue, which is to say his biological or stepchildren, other than my granddaughter Alara, ever attempt to benefit directly or indirectly from this trust, or are named as beneficiaries by Alara, the entire principal and all accrued interest will be immediately and irrevocably donated in full to the National Center for Abandoned Children. I closed the document with a sharp snap. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. I watched their faces crumble. The last, desperate flicker of hope didn't just die, it was brutally, publicly executed. The color drained from their faces, replaced by a pasty, sickly gray. It was the pure, ugly shock of total and complete defeat. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, which turned into a low, guttural scream of rage, and she rounded on Richard, her fists clenched. "You fool! You weak, pathetic fool!" Tiffany just collapsed onto the floor, her sobs now devolving into hysterical, animalistic wails. I let their agony wash over me. I had imagined this moment for years, and the reality of it was more satisfying than I could have ever dreamed. "So no," I said, my voice now deadly calm, the storm inside me finally spent. "You cannot stay with me. You cannot live in this house. You cannot have 1 single cent of my money." I gestured around the empty, gleaming room. "The work you did, the scrubbing, the painting, the yard work, that wasn't an investment. It wasn't a test of your character. It was your penance. It was the price you paid to stand here tonight and hear the truth. This house isn't a gift, it's a gravestone for the family you killed right here in this room all those years ago." I raised my arm and pointed a single trembling finger at the front door. "Now get out!" The words were quiet, but they had the force of a physical blow. They stumbled, broken and defeated towards the door. Brenda was still screaming at Richard, a tirade of vitriol and blame. Richard was a ghost, a hollowed-out man. Tiffany was being half-dragged, a blubbering mess. They tumbled out of the front door and disappeared into the darkness, their bitter, angry voices fading as they went. I stood alone in the center of the empty house, the house of my memories, the house of my reckoning. For the first time in 24 years, I let myself cry. A single tear traced a hot path down my cheek, but I was smiling. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated, and hard-won freedom. Revenge, I've learned, isn't really about destroying the people who hurt you. If you focus on that, you just end up chained to them forever, defined by their destruction. True revenge, the best kind, is about refusing to let them destroy you. It's about taking the poison they fed you and finding the antidote within yourself. I couldn't tear down my past. I couldn't erase the memory of the little girl crumpled on the sofa, clutching a postcard. So I decided to build on top of it. The scene changes. It's a few weeks later. The miserable, rainy night of the reckoning has been replaced by a bright, warm autumn day. The sun is shining. I'm standing on the site of the old house, my childhood home. But it's no longer a monument to decay and neglect. The broken windows are gone. The peeling paint has been stripped away. The overgrown yard has been tamed. A professional construction crew, my crew, is hard at work. The sounds aren't of bickering and incompetence, but of saws cutting, hammers striking, of progress, of creation. The house is being professionally and beautifully renovated, not for me to live in, but for something much more important. Planted firmly in the newly manicured lawn is a large, professionally printed sign. It reads, "The Phoenix House, a future transitional home for young adults aging out of foster care, a project by Alara Design." I took the ugliest, most painful part of my story, the very ground where my family fell apart, and decided to turn it into a foundation of hope for kids who, like me, were forced to learn how to be their own heroes. Kids who know what it's like to be an inconvenience, to be left behind. The Phoenix House will be a place where they can land softly, a place to get the support and skills they need to build their own lives, to design their own futures. The trust fund my grandmother left me wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon. But I chose not to use it for destruction. I'm using it to build. The claw she put in, the one that broke them, it wasn't just a poison pill. It was a signpost pointing me toward a better use for my anger and my pain. I stand there looking at the blueprints, a genuine smile on my face. Not the cold, chilling smile of revenge, but the warm, peaceful smile of someone who has finally found their purpose. I feel strong. I feel at peace. The fortress of silence I built around myself for 24 years is gone. It's been torn down, and in its place, I'm building a legacy of strength, resilience, and hope. I'm not the little girl they left behind anymore. I'm the woman who builds new foundations. They say living well is the best revenge. I used to think that meant having a bigger house, a more expensive car. But I think it means something more. I think it means taking the rubble of what they broke and building something beautiful from it. What do you think? Was this justice? I'd love to read your thoughts below.